Good morning and good afternoon from wherever you are joining us today. On behalf of the G20 Interfaith Forum and the Anti-Racism Initiative, I'm very honored to welcome you to our webinar today on Islamophobia. My name is Christina Tobias-Nahi, and I'm the Director of Public Affairs at Islamic Relief USA, and honored to be a member of the advisory of the G20 Interfaith Forum, as well as a member of the Working Group on Refugees, and more recently, an active participant in our new cross-cutting initiative on anti-racism. I also was very honored to be last year, in March of 2021, the host and moderator of our very first webinar, which we held on the first racism, looking at Native Americans and Indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere, in Canada and the US particularly. And since that initial inaugural event, we have had a series of webinars that looked at different ethnic and racial groups, from Asian Americans and hate crimes to African American representation in the media. And more recently, we have moved into a new space, which is our religious space. We started out with a webinar just a number of weeks ago. I hope that some of you were able to attend and participate in on anti-Semitism. And we are following that one today on Islamophobia. So it's come full circle for me hosting again about a year later. It's also very fitting, this topic, as a member side group of the G20 proceedings each year, in which we participate in person or virtually during the COVID years, at the hosting country of the G20, that this year is Indonesia in the fall. It's a Muslim majority country, and so it's particularly, of interest to me and to this panel to bring that in light of the context of what we're going to be discussing today, although we will be having more of a kind of a focus again on the Canadian and US, just for purposes of organizing and time zones only. But we hope to make this conversation wider in the weeks to come as we move into the G20. And as I say that, also it's very difficult to kind of, in an hour and 15 minutes, to summarize what is such a broad and pervasive topic, because our community and our faith community is not homogeneous across different geographical regions and divides, and even within, there's a lot of differences, and we will be addressing some of those today, and we will take some of those questions as well in the question and answer that we will have at the end, and we hope that you will be interactive and participate. We have a spectacular panel. I'm very excited to be hearing from them today. I think you will learn a lot. We're going to be putting their bios into the chat, as you have seen already the first one now, so I won't go into all of the details, and you were also able to see those when you registered as well. Before we kind of move on to our first speaker, I just want to put into some context as well today. There is an activity happening here in Washington, DC area where I am based, and we do have panelists, as mentioned, coming from a lot of different regions, both Canada, further south on the East Coast, and then out west. But today in the DMV area, there's actually an activity going on up on Capitol Hill. It's a Capitol Hill Lobby Day, where a lot of Muslims from across the US have convened onto Capitol Hill to do lobby meetings with their members of Congress. And one of the issues that they will be bringing up today is a request, or an ask, as we call it in Capitol Hill speak, to establish a special envoy at the State Department to report on Islamophobia. This has already gone to the US Senate. There are co-sponsors, including Senators Cory Bookin, Ben Cardin, and Bernie Sanders, around an International Combating Islamophobia Act. And so there is going to be a further act today by a lot of activists who are here in DC. And I think we're going to hear more about why something like this and a designated person to look at and address these issues would be so important. So without further ado, I would like to actually move on to a friend and colleague of mine, Ms. Reyhana Patel, who actually is my counterpart and holds a similar position as mine at our sister organization, Islamic Relief Canada. and they have just done some cutting edge research, and she's going to be sharing that with us all today. So please, Ms. Reyhana.
Right, thank you, Christina. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. So my name is Reyhana. I'm the Director of Communications and Government Relations here at Islamic Relief Canada. And today I want to talk a little bit about Islamophobia in Canada and some of the work that we've been doing, but also some of the situation and kind of what's going on in Canada. So a lot of you probably think or probably read that, Canada, we sort of developed this reputation of being this, friendly, multicultural country. I moved here in 2016. Before that, I lived in the United Kingdom and I grew up in the Caribbean in Barbados. And, when I moved here, I expected this inclusive, multicultural, tolerant society. And, while a lot of this is so true for the most part, there is an underbelly of hate and right-wing extremism that has been developing here and increasing for the better part of a decade. So, whereas before right-wing extremists with strong Islamophobic sentiments were delegated to obscure parts of the internet, democratization of the internet and the emergence of social media as an essential part of the online experience have emboldened these extremists and given them large platforms to promote and recruit their followers. And I want to share with you just two statistics that I came across in the last year that's been extremely shocking to me. So currently, Canada leads the world in publishing far-right white supremacist online content. It surpasses the UK and the US when spreading extremism online, white supremacist hate online. And in the last 5 years, more Muslims have been killed in targeted hate attacks in Canada than in any other G7 country. So when I first heard that, I was actually really shocked. But then, I've been here for about 6 years now. And in those 6 years, there were 3 violent Islamophobic attacks. In 2017, we saw a man kind of storm into a mosque during Friday prayer with a gun. He's a gunman. He killed 6 people and injured a lot more. And then last summer, we saw another man who rented a van and drove into a Muslim family who was walking down the street in London, Ontario, killing all of them except for their youngest son. And then where I live, most recently, a man kind of just went to the outskirts of a mosque and stabbed a Muslim man on his way to prayer. And that was in Toronto, and that's really close to where I am. And these are large-scale violent attacks. In addition to these, we've seen numerous incidences of anti-Muslim hate from women getting their hijabs ripped off to microaggressions in the workplace, violent attacks, and a lot of verbal abuse, both in person and online. And even for us, as a Muslim NGO, over the last few years, we've received a tremendous amount of hate, letters with threats, very horrific messages, a lot of online hate. And I'll give you one example. I just want to share a little picture with you if I can do that. So, yep, here we go. Just sharing this little picture with you. So somebody actually had the decency to rip out a piece of paper in an op-ed that I wrote in a newspaper and wrote these horrific messages and mailed it to my office. So these are just some of the examples of the hate that we get. I think I've stopped sharing now, so that's good. But often when we talk about Islamophobia, we read and hear about the political implications. And that's very important. You cannot combat Islamophobia without adequate legislation. The consequences of hate for ordinary people are often overlooked. And when my team and I were talking, in the aftermath of the London attack that we saw last year, we really wanted to share these stories. And so we decided that we would collect stories from people across Canada who experience anti-Muslim hate and put them together in a report. We just really wanted to share people's stories. And for this report, our team interviewed Muslim individuals across the country on their experiences with Islamophobia to better understand how this form of hatred manifests itself in Canada. Each person shared their unique incidences, showcasing just how ingrained Islamophobia is in each sector of our lives. And this ranged from occurrences at the workplace to sports games and relationships. I'm going to put the link of the report in the chat a bit later when I'm finished talking, but I just wanted to share with you a few stories, and I encourage you all to read the report because some of the stories are so powerful. But some of the ones that stood out for me, so there was Sana, a teacher in Quebec City. So I know a lot of you here probably aren't from Canada, but Canada is divided into provinces, and each province has its own, selected legislation. And in the province of Quebec, they introduced a bill very recently where religious symbols cannot be displayed or worn in public office or positions of power. So if you're a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher, you cannot wear a headscarf, you can't even wear a cross while you are working or in that profession. So Sana was a teacher and she wore the headscarf. And when that bill was passed, the school board basically told her, if you want to keep working here, if you want to be a teacher, you have to remove your headscarf. Sana actually wanted to fight. So she actually had to leave her job for a couple of months. But what she did is that she took her contract and, she got a lawyer, and they really, really kind of looked into that contract, evaluated it. And after a very lengthy fight with the school board, she found a loophole in her contract. It was a health loophole that allowed her to cover her head while she was teaching. But, it took months, and the experience was so traumatic for her that, when we spoke to her, she said that she was looking at leaving Canada altogether. And we haven't really followed up, so I'm not even sure if she's still in the country. And then we spoke to Saleha from British Columbia on the West Coast, where she told us that, while she was in school, a bunch of boys just ripped off her hijab and just started laughing at her. And when she tried to talk to her teachers about it, they basically said there was nothing that they can do. And then there was Aisha from Alberta, who decided, at a later point in her life, she wanted to wear the headscarf. So she walked into work one day wearing the headscarf, and her coworkers, particularly one, gave her a very hard time about it. A lot of comments, a lot of just, why are you wearing that? And this went on for months. And then we also spoke to Ayman Derbali, who was a survivor of the Quebec mosque shooting. So when the gunman stormed into the office, he tried to attack the gunman, and he was shot, and he's paralyzed from the waist down. And it's been a very, very hard, couple of years for him. But he was one of the survivors. And then we also spoke to this lady who married a Muslim. And then every time she would go to her home, they would give her such a hard time, like they would serve pork to their children, and it was just because she was Muslim, or she converted to Islam about it. So those are just some of the stories. There's a lot more, and I don't want to go and get into all of it, but I would really encourage you to read the report. But just to summarize what we found, we also ask a lot of other questions on Islamophobia, and we found that, Islamophobia is systematic, it's gendered, and it's normalized. Muslim women, we found, were the ones disproportionately being victims of Islamophobia because of their visibility, their headscarf, or the way they looked, the way they may dress. We also found that victims tend to dismiss their experiences of Islamophobia, believing they were minor and wouldn't be taken seriously if reported. A lot of them didn't even know where to report it. But what really, really stood out for me in the report, though, was that everyone that we spoke to, despite what they've been through, showed increased resiliency. Every survivor spoke about their increased commitment to their own way of life, Islam, being a Muslim, culture, dress, and then very importantly, making sure that Canada grows into a diverse and tolerant society. And I found this to be very humbling and inspiring, because over the last few years, I've also spoken to the widows of the 6 men that were killed in the Quebec Mosque City shooting. And, despite everything that they've been through, they were just so resilient and so, passionate about wanting to make a difference, and, always had faith in God. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And then, kind of goes back to my point about normalization. I only have a few more minutes left, but the findings of the report showed us, how normalized Islamophobia is within every level of society. Employment, dinner table, casual racist conversations. And this normalization is what leads to attacks like how we saw in London, Ontario last year, and in Quebec City a few years ago, and the many others that we were seeing. People don't wake up one day and decide that they're going to storm into a mosque and shoot a bunch of people. It's a process. And we really, really have to look at kind of what that process is. And finally, the last point I want to make is, we've been doing a tremendous amount of work here as a Muslim community across the country. There's been a lot of stuff that we Islamic Relief have been doing, but also, other civil society groups. We did have a national summit on Islamophobia with the federal government last year. And I know Christina mentioned there's a special envoy being appointed in the US. That's actually already been given the go-ahead by the government, and the applications are now coming in. So that's a good first step, but there is a lot more to be done. And until there's a collective societal shift in mindset that goes hand in hand with large-scale government action, Islamophobia will continue to pervade every aspect of Muslims' lives. And what we've seen, when hate bubbles under the surface for a very long time, it eventually spills over and becomes violent, leaving survivors and victims' families to pick up the pieces. So I'm going to end there. I think I went over a little bit of time, so I'm sorry about that.
No, thank you. Thank you, Reyhana, for sharing not only your personal story, but the stories of those you interviewed and met with. And we know that, it takes a lot to share that because they're in very, very vulnerable positions. And we aspire also to your, want for a diverse society. And I think we're going to pick that up in our next panel. But I just want to make one clarification. What is happening today in Washington, D.C. is actually a request for a special envoy in this position, because unlike Canada, we do not yet have it here in the United States. And given the uptick and the uprise of hate crimes and other, I think the community feels there is a need for such a position. So there's advocacy going on. It's already passed in the House, and now it's in the Senate. So kind of staying on that topic of how do you create a diverse society? Are we there? Why aren't we there? Where do we need to go? I'd like to bring in our next speaker, who's an academic from the West Coast, Dr. Amir Hussain, who's actually taught some courses, both on the Muslim community here in the United States, and then more recently, post the George Floyd shootings, looking at it with the anti-racism framework as well. So please.
Good morning, everyone. It's morning here in Los Angeles coming from Assalamu alaikum. So I say this as both academic who studies Islam and a Muslim, and it's lovely to follow Reyhana, because I grew up in Canada. My family came in 1970 to Toronto and left in 1997. So, in the Q&A, we could talk about stories about things that happened, from 1970 when I was there, in Canada. Wrote a dissertation looking at Muslims in Canada, and I've been out here in Los Angeles for 25 years. And so one of the things I want to talk about is the diversity within American Muslims. We often don't think about that the American Muslim community, along with Seventh-day Adventists, is a funny kind of thing, are the most diverse religious congregations in America. And so if you look at American Muslims, at least a quarter of us, and it's somewhere between 25 and 35%, depending on whose stats you look at, but at least a quarter are African-American. And that's important to talk about. People who've been Muslim for centuries, people who've been American for centuries. Islam in America goes back, documented at least to the transatlantic slave trade. We think there may have been earlier encounters, especially from West Africa coming to North America. But we're coming up on 500 years of the first documented Muslim, one of the slaves brought by one of the Spanish conquistadors, who dies in what is now New Mexico. And that's almost 500 years ago. So we have that history. So at least a quarter of American Muslims are African-American. A third are people like me, South Asians, from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. A third are Middle Eastern, and Middle Eastern, where I live in Los Angeles, could mean Iranian, it could mean Turkish, it could mean Arab. And then you have significant populations in other communities. So again, just using the Los Angeles example, we have a very strong Latino Muslim Association, the Los Angeles Latino Muslim Association. That's a couple of thousand people. If I was walking down the street with my friend Cesar Dominguez and he had a sign around his neck saying, "My name is Cesar Dominguez and I was born in Mexico City," you probably wouldn't think, "Oh, I bet that guy's a Muslim and I bet that guy's the Imam of a Islamic center in Los Angeles." Well, he's a Muslim, he's the Imam of an Islamic center in Los Angeles. So I think that internal diversity comes up with some of those issues that, if you encounter racism, well, anti-Black racism, which has been around for centuries, South Asian racism, Middle Eastern racism, specifically anti-Arab, or here in Los Angeles, anti-Iranian, post the revolution, all that kind of thing, that happens. we sometimes forget that history. And if I could, I just want to share a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation that talks about, some of this kind of history here. So it's this image, and sorry, I'm just going to get the image here so you can see the whole slide here. We forget this history sometimes of Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali. This is the actual shot from the fictional film Regina King's One Night in Miami, February 25th, 1964, when Muhammad Ali wins the heavyweight championship, shakes up the world, beats Sonny Liston, and then declares that he is a member of the Nation of Islam, that he's no longer Cassius Clay, he's now a Muslim who will become Muhammad Ali, and celebrates, with his friends, Malcolm X, Jim Brown, and the soul singer Sam Cooke. And so Regina King is in a fictionalized version of this, but it's really Malcolm that I think about here. This was one of his most famous lines, when he had been silenced by the Nation of Islam for some things he'd said. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. They haven't even pulled the knife out, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there. That's 1964. And you think, more than 50 years later, there's still that issue for Black folks. And I don't think we talk about, I don't think we talk about Dr. King often enough. We certainly don't talk about Malcolm enough. We don't talk about Muhammad Ali enough. If you've seen the new, relatively new Ken Burns documentary on Muhammad Ali, one of the things I loved about that was the focus on Ali for civil rights, for social justice in America as an American Muslim, as a member of the Nation of Islam, for his refusal in '67 to be inducted into the Vietnam War. James Cone, who died just a couple of years ago, did some marvelous work looking at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And this is one of his books, Martin, Malcolm in America, Dream or a Nightmare. And I just want to share this, and I'll stop the sharing here. This is in the preface to his revised edition. He says, Malcolm represented the flame of Blackness in Black theology, Martin the flame of faith in its Christian theological expression. In the 1960s, however, Malcolm and Martin's Blackness and Christianity were widely considered opposites. A war going on in Black America, Black and white America, between Martin and Malcolm. Everyone was forced to choose sides, but I could not. They were like my left and right hands, both necessary for the full expression of my humanity and for my struggle to find my voice in the Black freedom movement. It's a marvelous quote. And I think that's one of the things, and I'll just stop that share now. That's one of the things I think we don't think about. You go back to the 1960s, you go back to the ways in which Muslims were involved very much in these kinds of social civil rights programs. I literally was in Atlanta yesterday for a conference, and one of our speakers was the Imam Emeritus of the Atlanta Masjid, Imam Playman al-Alamin, marvelous civil rights figure. And you think, oh yeah, here we were talking about civil rights in Atlanta. Here's this African-American Muslim who for 50 years has been involved in doing that kind of work. And so I think that's really one of the key things here. And that comes through in the present day. And so I'm just using that African-American example. We could talk later about the South Asian ones. But just if I could share one more thing, we look at the wonderful work that Christina and Reyhana and other folks are doing here, in terms of the work, but it really is that political activity that becomes so crucial here. And here in America, just given our history, American Muslims have been here for centuries, but in numbers really only since the 1960s with the changes in immigration law. But you had, the first Muslim who was elected to Congress. And so I'm going to share that image here. This is, sorry, my apologies there. I messed up the shift here. So there we go. So, the sorry, I don't know why it keeps doing that. The person that was elected to Congress was Keith Ellison. elected in 2007, this extraordinary congressman from Minnesota, elected in 2006, sworn into office in 2007, and if you think about his work, it's really sort of fascinating to me to think, oh yeah, here is Keith Ellison, who a couple of years ago was the the Attorney General in Minnesota. So when you had the murder of George Floyd and the prosecution of the man who was convicted, for that murder, the Attorney General there who was behind this was Keith Ellison. Now, did Keith Ellison do this because he's an American Muslim? Did he succeed in this because he's an American Muslim? Of course not, because he's an outstanding lawyer and knows how to bring forward a case. But you have to think about the fact that, here is this person, this African American Muslim, who has done this extraordinary kind of work, and how much of that is based precisely on his connections to being an African American Muslim, to being involved in that struggle there. And so I think now I've figured it out. So you should be able to see the current side. So yeah, that's the slide I was looking for. Here's Keith Ellison. It's interesting, being sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an. That's in 2007. Here he is in 2021 as the Attorney General of Minnesota, doing that prosecution. And so really interesting kinds of things to think about, Ali 60 years ago, Keith Ellison now, and you do think of American Muslims at the forefront of doing this kind of anti-discrimination work. So let me stop the share and stop my comments. Thank you very much for this privilege to be with you.
Thank you, Dr. Amir, and that's a perfect segue, actually, as we move into talking more about the political landscape. We've worked closely at Islamic Relief with Keith Ellison, both when he was as a member of Congress and then subsequently after he departed. And most recently would have been last fall during elections. He got on our podcast and we did a Get Out the Vote. And since we're going to be talking about politics, he will be the first to kind of bringing that history of African Americans and the civil rights movement and how important it is to get your communities out there and present, and how important voting is. And as we go into another voting year, I'm sure we'll be working with him again to kind of amplify that message across all of the spectrums of ethnic communities that you mentioned, and bringing us together under that umbrella. So I would like to pass to Dr. Abbas Barzegar, and actually I had the occasion to be with him in person in the Washington, D.C. area a week or two ago. He came to Georgetown University. We had a research symposium, and I think as we, beyond his presentation, we're going to talk about the counter narrative and how you bring the positive to mainstream community and into the media about what Muslim civil society is doing to counter the negative. And so he will be able to speak to that as well. Thank you, Dr. Abbas.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for everybody. Thank you to everybody for inviting me and allowing me to speak today with you. I really enjoyed the presentations beforehand, even with the terrible news that you do bring, Reyhana, about sort of the realities of white supremacy in Canada, and also the rich history, Amir, that you brought together around the diversity of American Muslims. And for somebody who was also, in Atlanta and considers it home now, what you bring to light about sort of that integration of Muslims into the body politic, into the cultural fabric of our society. Atlanta is a great example of that, but we have, wonderful stories across the country. And so we actually do some mapping and some archival work around this as well. And to telegraph Christina's point that the ultimate counter narrative is information and education sharing and awareness raising about, really what society actually looks like beyond the narratives that exist within the media. But let's go to those narratives for a moment. Reyhana, you brought up an interesting point where you had said, Reyhana and Christina, I believe you brought up the point about structural Islamophobia, and the fact that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism are endemic problems within our society, very much the same way that we talk about structural racism, structural inequality, pervasive anti-Semitism, and the way in which these pathologies pervade our society are not merely in the kind of attitudinal level. These are not simply opinions that people have about Muslims or opinions that people have about Islam and Muslims and their history. Rather, that they manifest in concrete policy realities. They manifest in actual institutional type of violence, which is why our policy people are on the ground today on the Hill in Washington, D.C., demanding that the United States government take an approach to Islamophobia similar to the way in which they address other racist and xenophobic ideologies and pathologies. And so I wanted to maybe walk through just a moment today about what some of the linkages are behind that structural Islamophobia. It's one thing to talk about sort of the pervasive nature of anti-Muslim attitudes, the pervasive nature of Islamophobic attitudes, and we can just think it's sort of out there. We can point to maybe, a media representation is bad here or there, but it's really hard to get your head around how this actually manifests institutionally. So I'm going to try to lay that out just a little bit for us today, and maybe we can reverse engineer it a little bit. Let's go to one of the most obvious examples of structural anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia, and that would be in President Trump's announcement, even when he was, when he was a candidate and even a primary candidate, that he wants to impose a ban on Muslim immigration. Okay. All right. This is a piece of rhetoric that quickly manifested as soon as he was sworn into office into a policy initiative. Now, what that means is that, you move from the attitudinal, irrational anti-Muslim fervor, and you translate that into an actual law that affects millions of people's lives. We can see something similar in terms of the way in which mosques are being prohibited from being built with certain kind of structures in different parts of Europe. We can see it within the laws that you mentioned, Reyhana, around religious symbols in Canada or in France, and et cetera. When we move from rhetoric into law, we have a major issue. And so, President Trump's Muslim ban was ultimately struck down to the point where it turned into a kind of national security risk ban, immigration ban. And, in my opinion, even if that ban is cloaked and has, a kind of vestige of racism and xenophobia in it, I'm proud that the courts and the democratic institutions that we have, can stop that type of process. But how is it that we even move from the fringe into the center the way that we did in the context of the Muslim ban? And what I'd like to share is that it's not Trump that comes up with something like this. Rather, it's decades and decades of think tanks, of huge institutional money, of special interests, private groups that all have different kinds of agendas that literally promote hatred and bigotry in our society. And these, the way in which these things work is typically through, again, you have think tanks, you have nonprofit organizations, other kinds of quote unquote civil society organizations, loose networks, loose affiliations, and they create these silos of ideology and thought activity. I don't want to call it thought leadership, but they create a discourse that then then is always ready to be deployed. And so even in a moment where we don't see the Islamophobia front and center, we know that it's on the fringe, and we know that it's being cultivated. There's a whole set of institutions around it. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the structure behind some of these institutions and how is it that they actually survive. So I'm going to share a slide with you real quick to bring to your attention something that happens very uniquely in the United States contexts. And this is how, this is a description basically of how Islamophobic or anti-Muslim, Islamophobic, and even just generally a lot of hate groups and extremist groups are funded in the United States. Now, this is not the primary way in which they're funded, but this is one of the most sinister mechanisms that exist out there. And I'm going to introduce you to something called, if you're not familiar, something called a donor-advised fund. A donor-advised fund is for for all intents and purposes, something that we might call a charitable checking account, a charitable checking account. So let's say, you know, our friend Christina wants to donate to a, you know, a charity, but she doesn't know really when she wants to donate to that charity. And she kind of doesn't want the charity to know, or others to know, that she donated it to, you know, to that charity. So she goes to a bank, basically, a charitable bank, which in this case we would call a foundation. This could be something as large as, let's say, Fidelity Charitable, you know, Foundation, or Schwab's Charitable Foundation, Bank of America, or it could be a local foundation such as, you know, the Chicago Community Trust, or the, you know, the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta, and so forth. These foundations provide the mechanism, just like a bank would, to hold your money. And then you can deploy that money however you would like. Again, just like a charitable checking account. You even have an online portal and everything, and you just kind of click a few links and you tell them where to send the money. However, the real kicker is this, is that when you give the money to the charitable checking account, to the foundation, they give you the tax write-off, and then the money technically belongs to them. However, you maintain, for all intents and purposes, actual control over the use of that money. So when you send that money off, is everybody still able to see my screen still? Okay. When you send that money off, the money goes from Fidelity or Schwab or Bank of America or the Community Foundation of Atlanta to the organization. So in this graphic, you see basically this is how it comes. The dollars go into the big bank, the foundation, and however, the person still directs where the money goes. And so we find money being funded all across the country to anti-Black groups, Islamophobic lobbyists, anti-gay rights folks. And we literally see millions and millions of dollars funneled this way annually, that's taking care of, or that's taking advantage of our charitable sort of tax code. And the real unique situation in the United States is that, and this is the problem in the United States, is that the United States has an extremely high threshold for what counts as free speech and freedom of expression. It has a very high threshold for, for anything that might say, this is a violation of free speech. So nonprofits get cleared very easily by the tax code. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. They get cleared very easily. They get cleared very easily by the tax code, and they can basically say that they're an educational institution, that they're involved in public education and advocacy, and they can go say whatever they want, because it's very hard to prove in a US court that something that you're doing is a violation of free speech or is hate or somehow, inciting to violence. And so you have this kind of free for all. I'll end by this, and I'll say that, the organization that I direct, the Horizon Forum, has given up on the idea that you can stop this problem legally. Instead, what we do is we coach foundations from a risk management and a values alignment type of perspective. And we encourage them to implement their own policies to prevent this kind of funding from happening. So we coach and train organizations, and we have over 30 institutions so far enrolled in our program that basically implement an anti-hate policy and a due diligence protocol. And I have to say that it's quite effective. And I think that kind of leadership from civil society, being philanthropy itself, that leadership goes a long way in today's really highly unregulated, disjointed governance system. And I think it's a message to all of us at the global level as well, is that, let's stop counting on governments to do the job for us. And let's, as civil society leaders, institute policies and practices to prevent this kind of harm from further eroding our democratic values locally and internationally. So thank you all again very much for allowing me to join you and to share some of these thoughts. I look forward to our conversation, inshallah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you do in the research and policy space. Another organization, if people are interested in, delving more into some of the data sets, and incidentally, there is no national data set on Muslims in the United States. Data is not collected around religious affiliation. As everyone knows from the census, we just had one recently. It's not collected in federal government amongst their employees. And so there are also pushes as DEI, diversity, equity initiatives, in inclusive hiring, inclusive retention is happening. You know, there are questions arising around how do you do that when you don't even know your baseline of who your employees are. So there's a lot of movement in the federal space to start collecting that in the next census. I mean, there's been for a number of years people pushing that as well to be able to do that. And, you know, as people are starting to think through and prepare their questions, and you can send them via the chat, I'm going to mention one more research, and then I'm going to pose a question to the panelists that I've alluded to earlier. But there's another group that I would, you know, recommend people check out that's called ISPU. That's the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, that does a lot of work here in the United States and collects data sets on the Muslim community, philanthropy, Islamophobia, our youth, a number of things. And they've done a lot of surveys, and they recently had a policy conference last week, actually, where they presented a number of slides. And they showed some correlations where a higher Islamophobia index, so people who were exhibiting on these surveys more tolerance for Islamophobia, were secondarily also exhibiting, not surprisingly, you know, a higher, well, more support for the ban that was mentioned, surveillance of houses of worship and mosques, but also such things as limiting freedom of the press and supporting discriminatory policies in hiring and otherwise, and just in general, had a greater acceptance of more authoritarian attitudes and people in politics. So as we move into another election, something to be a little concerned about, and more of that research can be found on their website. So I guess staying on that refrain as we're waiting for some of the questions to roll in, because of the research that's done by our speakers, because of the actual programmatic implementation done by my colleague and myself at Islamic Relief, you know, part of what we try and do is not combat, as was just mentioned, it's hard to do legal challenges, it's hard to do, you know, some of even this policy, it works very slowly, and the laws. So how do you just do the good work you're doing, or share out the good work that the Muslim community is doing in order to change that narrative that way? So that's more of a person-to-person approach as opposed to a more, you know, legislative approach. So I'm going to ask that first to Reyhana, if she can talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So it's a difficult one. So as an NGO, obviously we're constrained to, you know, what we can do legally and advocacy wise as well. There are certain restrictions in Canada here. But I mean, Islamic Relief generally, we do a tremendous amount of work around the world, you know, from programming to advocacy. One of the things that I focus on at Islamic Relief is the gender work. So, you know, we look a lot at how, you know, faith can actually counter, you know, acts of violence against women and kind of working and training women across the world. When I first started the job, I did not expect like a lot of my work to be doing like combating hate and looking at negative media articles. You know, it was just supposed to be about, you know, you're trying to put out a lot of positive stories about Islamic Relief, try and get like our media coverage going. And 50-60% of my work now is just dealing with like hate, all the hate that comes in. What do we do? All the false accusations. And, you know, and then my team is also working on that too. And it's very unfortunate because it takes us away from all the other work that we could be doing, like all the work in the communities, all the community engagement work, all the work on gender that I could do, all the other research on gender that we could potentially do. So yeah, it's a difficult one, but, you know, we try and have a balance. I think, well, I don't know how it is in the States, but here in Canada, we have a good civil society Muslim space, that there are a lot of Muslim organizations who are on the same page. They're advocating for, you know, for an end to Islamophobia, for a lot of hate, to be ended. So I think that's happening. So I think as a balancing act, we try and do as much as we can. We try and drown out a lot of the stuff that comes in, but not all the time, you know. Not all the time is possible. And so, you know, you're right, you're protecting the organization, you're protecting the Muslim community, but at the same time, you still want to do a lot of the good work. We do have a bit of a challenge here in Canada. There's been a lot of instances in the last 2 years. We were seeing a lot of Muslim charities being targeted for audits by the Canada Revenue Agency. And it's a very dangerous place to be in, because if you, without kind of saying a little too much, but without looking at kind of how the past audits have been done about Muslim charities, it's very concerning, and it's a worry to us, because, we're doing everything that we can, but, we have that threat, like, any Muslim charity can get shut down. So there's a lot of other things happening, but, at the end of the day, we're trying to do the good work that we do. That's the mission of the organization, to reduce poverty and suffering around the world. And we will continue to do that the best the way that we can.
Yeah, wonderful. I'll just give a case study from Islamic Relief USA, because we also work hand in hand with the American Red Cross, and we respond to natural disasters here in the United States, whether they're recent wildfires or hurricanes, floods. We seem to have a good share of disasters, and we were able to, and we go into communities often in the South. I'll give a case study a number of years ago in Louisiana when there was some major flooding, and we encounter communities that have actually never met, a Muslim. And because they see our co-branded vests, it's the American Red Cross, and we're there to help, and we're picking up debris, and we're mucking out the mud that got into their homes. It really, that's what I meant when, we're able sometimes just to change it on the individual level, because they will say, thank you, we've never, met a Muslim before. We didn't have this idea from what we see in the media that you would be out here helping us in whatever X region of where that disaster has just hit. So that's the important work that groups like ours and others do on the ground. And we also work a lot with refugees. And I know prior to today, and even at the outset, I mentioned that, we're part of the refugee working group. So I invite you, this is just one webinar of the G20 Interfaith Forum. There's a series of webinars, not only under the mantle of the Anti-Racism Initiative, but amongst the different working groups that link back to the G20, whether it's climate change and the environment, whether it's gender that Reyhana just mentioned, whether it's something like refugees. And we know, even as of this week, we've seen alarming new numbers from the UN High Commissioner on Refugees about displaced people across the globe and the world. And one of the places where we have seen some racism now, and it's come to the forefront, is around the different welcoming reception that refugees have received as they cross into countries based on their race and religion. And I know, Dr. Abbas, you mentioned you've also looked at this a bit as well. So I'd like to invite you to talk about this a bit.
Yeah, I can I can jump in, especially, I mean, the refugee and migration issue is a very critical one, especially as the G20 discusses. There's 100 million refugees around the world now is the kind of latest number, and we anticipate, or expect somewhere around 60% of them at least are coming from Muslim communities. Now, it's not simply a migration flow from like it was a few years ago, just from Syria, Turkey to Greece. It's really impacting the entire world. And what's happening is that you have this insularity taking place and a kind of nationalism taking place all across the world. And sometimes it's coupled with a religious nationalism. And the counter to that, and the counter to that is not I shouldn't say the counter, the sort of an implication of most nationalisms is a kind of exclusion, an exclusion narrative. Who is part of the community and who is not part of the community. And so in the context of migration, we see hate activity come up when we see, when people talk, for example, about, in the United States, they talk about migrant caravans coming up from South America. And invariably what they discuss are criminal gangs that are going to come and rape your children, excuse me, right? But they talk in this way, or Afghan refugees that are coming to be terrorists, et cetera. And there's this kind of real hyperbolic type of sentiment that's out there in some, in, let's say, again, fear-mongering media. However, there are still legitimate kind of, or posing to be legitimate discourses that talk about Muslim migrants coming and bringing certain kinds of diseases that Europe has never known before, or they come with the intention of populating and populating, increasing their population numbers, increasing their community numbers, and extracting, public resources. When in fact, what we find is that the research on refugees is that they're some of the most entrepreneurial, skilled, ambitious, and hardworking sort of segments to a society. And in fact, some studies suggest that there's a net positive on economic development when you have an influx of migrants in any kind of context, because of that versatility, that ambition to work and fill the gaps within the economy. But one of the most sinister things about this, anti-immigration sentiment that's out there on the white supremacy front is that there's a kind of a trope within white supremacist circles called the Great Replacement theory. And there's this fear that white society, Northern European and, their descendants and, connections in other parts of the world are being actively replaced by migrants, and that there is a kind of wholesale conspiracy to destroy the white race, and international immigration, particularly supported by the United Nations, particularly coming from Muslim contexts, that this is a fundamental fact, and this is a kind of fundamental component of this conspiracy. And it's quite sinister, it's quite scary. And we recognize that, these ideas, again, they're not just little fringe, hyperbolic, media frenzy type of discussions. There are whole books written about this. There are treatises written about this. And they, if you study this material, there'll be the hyperbolic stuff, there'll be the really kind of out there treatise, but then all of a sudden you see it entering into the mainstream. All right, cloaked just a little bit just a little bit here or there. And it's really the think tanks, the policy circles, and some of these networks out there that are enjoying some of the 501c3 funding and charitable status that are translating the extremist to the mainstream. And it's a very dangerous sort of space to monitor. There is a question in the Q&A about something that I mentioned. Is that okay if I address that now, Christina?
Please do, because I actually have not seen them come through yet, so please do. There's
a question by someone who asked that, that said basically the donor advised fund are usually very carefully checked to make sure that the funding goes to 501c3s, and asked for some kind of evidence about how big the problem actually is. And so I did want to clarify that it is the case that the hate groups that we're talking about, that the hate groups that we are talking about actually are 501c3s. That's not really the problem. The problem is, that the hate groups, they receive this funding because there are no legal sort of regulations. And so I just wanted to share quickly a headline from a group called the Chronicle of Philanthropy. The Chronicle of Philanthropy is sort of the New York Times of philanthropy news. And so if you don't mind, I'll just share this screen quickly so it can tell the story. The Chronicle of Philanthropy reported just last year that there was about $53 million funneled to hate groups that were just identified as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is just a leading outfit. But I will say that the Southern Poverty Law Center tracks, I'd say, about half of the 501c3s that we track. So we track a much wider group of extremist and hate groups out there. And so the numbers out there vary depending on the lists that you use, but there's really no question that there are tens of millions of dollars being funneled out this way. In our own experience, I've overseen the closure of dozens of accounts that are funding, hate groups because of this problem. So there's definitely different ways to chop up the research, but it's not really a question that it's happening. The other thing that I would like to say, however, though, is that to the discussant's point, donor advised funds themselves are not the problem. Donor advised funds, I'm actually a kind of a big believer and advocate in this philanthropic vehicle. I don't believe that the institution itself is a problem. I believe that the issue at hand is the lack of due diligence and internal policies to regulate this spending. And there's nothing really more to it than that. If foundations just take this problem seriously, they can divert that funding, they can stop that funding, they can ask donors to send their money elsewhere, they can ask their donors to go to another foundation. But the fact that it enters into this public space unregulated and unfiltered, somebody has to take responsibility for that. And I think that's what leadership comes down to today.
Thank you. And thank you for our audience participant who asked that question. And please, we would encourage you to keep questions rolling in. Otherwise, we're going to have our panelists start asking questions of one another, but we would love to make this interactive. Dr. Amir, I want to actually pose this one to you because Reyhana and I have spoken about a bit about how we work both with community and with the media. I neglected to say, like in the case of the Louisiana flooding, we actually had an embedded journalist from one of the national papers that joined our deployment group as well. So, that's a way to also have the media narrative change. But you're working with young people. You're at the university, you're teaching courses. I'm curious about the types of questions and stereotypes and disinformation that's coming up and how you're dispelling that, because they are going to be our next generation of leaders. And it's very critical that we are able to cultivate their minds. So how is some of that work being done and what are you seeing?
Yeah, thanks for that, Christina. And it's a great question. So there are a couple of things there. If you look at American Muslims, we're no different than other American religious communities, meaning only about half of us sort of say that we connect and do regular worship and go to a mosque. In the same way, only about half of Americans say, they actually do this kind of thing. It's the universities, I think, which are really fascinating because, not to be stereotypical, Muslim parents, regardless of where they are, send their kids to university. They want their kids to, succeed and have great careers and do that kind of thing. So in many interesting ways, it's the university setting. We were really talking about the development of students, both the Muslim students. My university, private Jesuit university, has maybe 6,000 students, but half of those are Catholic. Maybe 250 of those are Jewish, maybe 250 of those are Muslim. We have a Muslim student life, we have Jewish student life, we have campus ministry, those kinds of things happening. And so part of it is exactly, you said, the media, and I live in Los Angeles where the media is king. We produce all of this media that gets used around the world. The negative side of it you saw post 9/11. You've seen it before, but the sort of shows like Homeland or 24 where you have the Muslim terrorist. The positive side now is young Muslims being involved in this. So just seeing the billboards for the new Ms. Marvel with Kamala Khan, Rami Youssef doing Rami, United States of Al, these kinds of things where Muslims sort of show up. And whenever I speak with the sort of creative groups, it's always saying, hey, I'm not saying have the star be a Muslim. It'd be great if you had the star be, I don't know, a theology professor teaching at a Jesuit school. There's got to be a show on that. But and what I am saying is, please don't make the bad guy the Muslim. Is just show the reality of American Muslim life. Like have the lady who manages a Starbucks be a Muslim in hijab, because the manager of the Starbucks I go to is a Muslim woman in hijab who's does that kind of thing. You're going to do a show, Community, this great show that ran. It's been off the air for a while with Joel McHale. It's about a community college. Well, one of those characters, the character Danny Pudi plays, is a Muslim, because guess what? There are Muslims in community colleges. That kind of thing I think becomes so important about changing the narrative. And the other part, and Reyhana, this again goes back to the Canadian context, is in 1970, when I moved to Canada, I would never think that I would see a hijabi Muslim woman, being the voice, the anchor of the CBC News. And so I'm not saying there aren't problems, there are huge problems, and we can talk about that, especially with the Quebec law that in effect makes it legal to discriminate against Muslims. I'm saying, like, wait, how can you do this? How can you have this kind of thing in a country that says we're going to have freedom of religion? But and how can this province sort of do that? So that's a sidebar to that. But the fact that here you have this hijabi woman who is the lead anchor on the CBC News, and so I think those kinds of things become really important. And I've said I'll stop here. As a Canadian, I have to talk about hockey. The fact that you've got like Nazem Kadri playing for the Avalanche, and I've always said, look, isn't that what's going to change the discourse in Canada, is having Muslim hockey players? That's what people pay attention to. Forget about anything that I do. It's that, and the fact that you've got Muslims playing in the NHL. So absolutely, Christina, I think the media images and working with students to develop those and help them to understand those is really powerful.
I'm just going to jump in because I feel like my talk was a lot of negative stuff, but I do want to agree with that. Like, there are, I would say, like, there's a lot of Muslim women, especially, that are in leadership positions within Canada. Like, look at Parliament, for example. You had the first woman minister for international development. So it's not all bad. Like, there's a lot of things that are happening on the positive side, but there are also things that work needs to be done. So just wanna kind of point that out.
Yeah, and on that too, I mean, I thank you. I know Dr. Amir shared the inauguration of our first Muslim in Congress, Keith Ellison, who has since moved on, but we do still have Andre Carson, and we have two women in the last election cycle, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. And not all of the challenges, just to have an open and honest conversation here, always come from the external forces. Ilhan Omar has a very interesting autobiography out. I think it's called This Is What America Looks Like. And it talks about her journey from being a refugee herself, being resettled in the US, all the challenges and supports in that life, and then ascending to her local state legislator and then as a congresswoman. And she talks about also that a lot of those challenges in that trajectory also came within her own community, right? And what is a norm of the gendered and political involvement that different communities see and want and aspire to as well. I'm getting some questions in, but I'm going to ask for one as I get a chance to read these. And obviously, I did tell the panelists if they had questions for each other, they could also ask each other, so I don't want to hog. This will be my last one. I actually met with the executive director this past weekend of American Muslim Health Professionals, who was sharing some research that they were doing. And just because we have talked about some of the violence, whether it's violent rhetoric that comes in a mailing, to someone, or shootings and things of this nature, and about COVID and mental health and the uptick on mental health emergencies of young people. And we've seen that, unfortunately, here in the United States with some recent shootings and other things. And interestingly, a piece of a data point that I was not aware of, and I just wanted to bring up as well, is some of these youth lines and suicide prevention lines and others that Health and Human Services and other groups have. If you call in, especially as a young person, and they gather some information, if you had called in on a suicide line, for example, and you are of a different faith tradition, you will get resourced to get some mental health counseling. However, if you call in and you have a Muslim sounding name, you will get flagged by Department of Homeland Security as a security risk. And it goes into like a political thing. So, as we're looking at young people and all the challenges, and people are not only dealing with COVID and coming out of that, and Islamophobia and how that kind of weighs on them into this mental health space, I'm just wondering if anyone wants to speak to that a little bit. And if not, I'll give you a chance to think about that.
Let me say a word. I think Abbas wanted to say something too. I think part of it is it's the resources. So, what I was saying at the beginning, that, we're once this very old community, having been here literally since, 1538 with the first documented sort of Muslim slave, but the resources are relatively new. And so, we started here in LA, I think it was, I want to say it's either 98 or 2002, the Access California services for, how do you access mental health services for American Muslims? So those things are relatively new, because that sense of creating institutions, like the first Muslim social service agency in Canada was the 1990s, because that's where you start to have this kind of shift. And I think in a really interesting way, what you're seeing, not to be stereotypical, but with the number of Muslim doctors, this sort of interest in medicine, in the mental health part, like again, here in America, don't get me started on the issues around access to medical health, but that's so much better than access to issues around mental and psychological health. Like my university, we have 6,000 students. We literally hired last year 20 full-time psychologists new to do our student psychological services, and they're still like 3 weeks out. So if you try to book an appointment with our student psychological services, the earliest they can get you is 2.5 weeks in, and that's having hired like literally, doubled our thing. So I think we have like 42 psychologists, working there. So it's huge demands, especially post COVID.
Yeah, I can jump in there and say that's what we've been seeing as well. Like the demand has increased. And again, it's access to services it's an issue here too. A lot of, there are community services available, but they're fully booked. Like there was one I was looking at, they're fully booked for the rest of the year. Like nobody can book an appointment. So the demand is there. And then even, if you're Muslim or not accessing mental health, it's very difficult unless you're covered in a benefits plan with your organization. There's very limited resources out there available. So I think Muslim organizations are recognizing that need, but it's about kind of making those resources more available, making sure that a lot more youth programs are available and those are being incorporated into those. So yeah.
We had a question for the audience, and I know we're coming up against time, so this may be the last question from the audience before we move into concluding remarks. Someone had a question that they were querying, and from their own personal sense that Islamophobia may have started around 9/11, so they wanted some clarity on that, if it predated that, or if that really was like the onset of what we're talking about today. And their sense that some of that fear was because of fundamentalist Islam, and they excuse themselves for using that term. They weren't sure exactly how we wanted to coin that. And so they're wondering how this was being addressed within Muslim organizations, within academia, within the political scene, etc.
Could I jump in on that?
Please.
It kind of ties into what what I wanted to say on the last point too. There is a broadly speaking, there's a global governance sort of move to prevent violent extremism, okay, or counter violent extremism. This now includes multiple ideologies, white supremacist, separatist organizations based on ethnicity, but a large part of it was grounded in combating what people would call militant Islam or extremist Islam or fundamentalist Islam. And there are problems with using any of those terms to describe a religion, right? Because, it's just not nomenclature for us to say something like, violent extremist Judaism, violent extremist Christianity. Somehow that's not as common as we would say, violent extremist Islam. There are other ways to talk about it. We actually wrote a book called Political Islam, debating the term, and we literally sort of held a debate on the utility of some of these terms. I think that's a separate conversation, but I do think that everybody recognizes that there are religious nationalist organizations and networks and discourses and ideologies out there that take on militant forms around the world. And in the Muslim world, there are multiple organizations and institutions like that. I don't think that anybody should shy away at all. It's actually our responsibility to recognize, what those organizations are, what their backgrounds are, and how they operate and things like that. So the fact is that, there are many, many eyes internationally on this issue. The question for me becomes, when you have a broad policy and governing, movement out there, how is it that you actually direct the resources and attention to that issue? And do we exaggerate that issue? And do we kind of get into a mission creep of that issue? And what I mean here is, there is no business to assuming, and there's no logical evidence-based nothing to assume that a refugee that is suffering from mental health issues is a security risk. Okay, like there's absolutely no reason. There's no data to support that. There's nothing. Actually, the data on these militant movements is that they don't come from these backgrounds. The data on these militant movements for foreign fighters and others is that they come from very educated middle-class backgrounds, and that they're just full participants committed to this theological vision. It's not the case that people are being brainwashed, manipulated, abused. I'm sure that happens. But the idea that sort of every Muslim is vulnerable, every Muslim that is vulnerable is automatically vulnerable to some kind of terrorist exploitation, and that everybody needs to sort of be on guard. No, I think that's where the policy community gets it wrong. If they focus on really kinetic responses and good police work, the same way that you deal with any other organized criminal organization, you'll be able to contain these movements. It's when we bleed into ideology, fear, and that's where the irrational Islamophobia comes in, that it doesn't make any sense. And it starts to disrupt, the entire purpose of what these programs are all about. So I spent a great deal of the last 10 years trying to roll back some of these countering violent extremism programs, where I saw them doing this mission creep into the social services work. We should feel comfortable as a community and a set of practitioners to approach our city and our municipality for assistance when community members who've suffered war and trauma need assistance. And we should be able to do that in the full confidence that our health is the priority, that our society is a priority, and that we're not presenting our people as a security risk, to others. And so we would really appreciate sober conversations around these discussions, because we're the frontline responders at the end of the day, and we understand the differences here. So take the Muslim practitioners' word seriously on how to deal with these issues, and I assure you that everybody's doing their part to address these problems.
Thank you so much. And that may have been part of your concluding remarks folded in just for time's sake. I know Dr. Amir's got a class he needs to jump off and teach in just a bit. So I'd like to offer some time up both to Reyhana and Dr. Amir to offer some concluding remarks based on the conversation today and maybe next steps.
Let me jump in there and give Reyhana the last word here. So just back to that point. No, Islamophobia doesn't start 9/11. That there's a unfortunately long, rich history before that. So you go back to 79 with the revolution in Iran. You go back to establishment of the state of Israel and Arab-Israeli stuff. The gasoline things we're dealing with now. Like, my students are too young to remember the lineups in LA for gas because of OPEC oil shortages. So you've negative things about Islam and Muslims you can project back. But I think precisely it's the work, and I'm hopeful. I'm in education. You have to be hopeful if you're in education, is that we make these kinds of changes. We do this kind of work. We know there's going to be these issues, and I'm so thankful for these organizations, particularly Reyhana, Christina, Abbas, that you're part of, that I think are helping to address this and to talk about the place and the role of American Muslims here in America, Canadian Muslims in Canada, or Muslims around the world. It's as full-fledged members of their communities, participating politically, democratically, in the right kinds of ways.
Reyhana.
Yes, I will jump in there. I mean, very well. Lots of great words there. I mean, I kind of echo a lot what Dr. Amir said and Dr. Abbas as well, but I'll conclude with, this conversation was great. Like, there's a lot of different elements coming from it. We need to have more education, more conversation. There's a lot of great work doing within Muslim communities and as a civil society together. And I think just kind of bringing people together, bringing faith together, having that conversation and having those understandings, and keep doing the work that everyone's doing. And I'll end there.
She saved you some time, Dr. Abbas. Do you want to? Maybe
No.
Next steps? No.
Thank you very much for everybody. I mean, obviously we do need to have continued conversations and systematic ones. And so inshallah, we can make these things a priority. But the most important priority is really taking care of these refugees and these vulnerable communities that are out there. And with a convening like this, with the stakeholders in the room, let's amplify some of the programming that's already doing a great job.
Wonderful. Yeah, so again, this was just the beginning. It's part of a full-fledged series of important conversations that need to be had both on the outskirts of the G20 itself, whether it's going into Indonesia this year as a Muslim majority country, going into India next year as a Muslim minority country, where we know there are a lot of country tensions breaking out right now at this very moment as we speak, and into subsequent years that are hosting. We will continue to keep this issue on the radar and how to work interfaith, how to work with allies, how to work with the youth, how to support our youth that are experiencing the scourges of Islamophobia, and it's making them have increased mental health issues, and how we can all come together and support them as well. In the context of our series, I know they will be posting both this live recording as well as a summary. I know there's a couple of more series coming up. We've got one on Hinduism coming up. As I mentioned, India will be the subsequent host of the G20 following this year in Indonesia. So we're already looking forward to that and engagements there. And we've got some more on the Native American Indigenous communities coming up as well. Also looking at the Canada context and the visit of the Pope this summer and apologies there. So there's too much to unpack. There's, you know, a lot of communities. I think, thank you, Dr. Amir, you shared a, you know, a very potent quote with us that we can't even begin to have these discussions until we pull out that wound, the knife completely out of the wound. And that's what we're trying to do through this series, looking at communities that have been wounded, that continue to be wounded, and trying to help them with that healing process, or seeing where these conversations can continue in order to do that. And we have reached the conclusion of our time. So thank you so much again for those on the East Coast, West Coast, in between, in our Canadian hosts, and as well as those who joined us internationally from whatever time zone. We were so happy to have you with us today, and please continue to be part and engaged with the G20 Interfaith Forum. And have a wonderful rest of your day or evening.